All right, good to have everybody. Appreciate you coming in this afternoon. As you know, this stuff's recorded, so it's available online. If you want to share it with anybody else or anything like that, feel free to be able to do that as well. We'll put the slides out there too. So today's session, so just briefly, of course, we want to give you just a bit of, right? So this is all coming to you part of our center. So just a quick reminder about who we are and some of the stuff that we've done. We've been around for a couple of years now and kind of getting ourselves settled in, and really appreciate your support and all the different stuff. Core portfolio of educational programs as well. And so invite you to take a look at our website. We'll share that with you if you've got it already, and you probably know it pretty well. So there, you're stuck with me today for today's session, and Nicole's going to help back me up, and Kenny will as well. So I'm Will Brown, the director of the center. Been at the Bush School for almost 15 years, professor, and primarily I studied nonprofit management. And as you know, one of the sort of boards have been the area. It's what I did my dissertation work on. So those of you who are familiar with my work, I've been thinking about this idea for quite a long time, and where this topic comes from is in doing this work and in thinking about boards and how they function and how they operate. One thing I always heard from a lot of people is I can't get my board members engaged. I can't get people to connect. I can't people feel like they're doing the job that needs to get done. People aren't coming to board meetings, blah, blah, blah. So they kept using the term engagement. And at some point, as you can see, I think on the original slide there references the article that that this is based upon, or come up here, I'll share you the article that this is based upon, is back 2013, 2014. I really tried to get into the literature and understand what do we mean by board, what do we mean by engagement, what does that look like in organizations, and take a look at some of those ideas. Those of you who may be familiar with any of my stuff is I tend to have models. I can't help myself. I come to any session with a model ready to share, and so I'm going to expose those to you a couple today. But this first one really just kind of contextualizes this talk so that you can see in the way that I think about, or the way that we think about board performance and organizational performance. So this idea that, board performance is sort of what we're trying to get at, right? We want our boards to perform well. We're really trying to get at this idea of improving the performance of our organizations overall. And what this model lays out is a relatively simple idea, is that having the right people at the table, having the right number of board members, having the right board there with the right capabilities. So yesterday's talk was about capabilities of board members and thinking about how we define that, and I could give you that talk as well. Today's is actually a little bit more on this idea of board performance and talking about how we get people engaged. So once we've got people at the table, and part of our advice today is going to be making sure you have the right people, because it facilitates their capacity to become engaged. You then want to structure things. You want to make sure and build relationships to have them carry out the right tasks or functions. And that key component, if you can get them to do that, that linkage between this first bullet and this second box is pretty solid. The linkage between some of this second and third is a little more tangential. And so it can be a little trickier for us to be able to clarify exactly how this linkage works, but we do have some pretty good data that suggests that performing particular functions, engagement in a strategic function, engagement in building of relationships, contributes to our organization and the way that our organization functions and operates. And this comes back down to why. So I'm going to talk quite a bit today, and the question is going to be, do I invest this much energy and time to engage board members, and why? And this is really the key piece, right? We really want our boards to contribute to the capacity of our organizations to achieve the impacts that are important for us to be sustainable in the ways we need them to be sustainable, and for our for people to have good people to ascribe a good belief system or reputation to us as an organization, and boards can be instrumental in all those areas of board organizational performance. So that lays out the context of what we're talking about, and this is specifically what I'm going to get in today. I'm going to define engagement. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's the outcomes of engagement in reference to performance for at the board level, and then talk about the model itself and talk about antecedents to engagement, and then talk about a couple of mediators. And there's the reference to the article that I did with Chris Cornforth in pulling together, and this was in that book, New Perspectives on Nonprofit Governance, an edited book that we pulled together. That's something, how time's passing, huh? Okay, so briefly, what is engagement? Engagement is a pretty broad concept. It has to do with both cognitive and affective elements of an individual, also potentially described or conceptualized as psychological energy, in the extent to which people bring their whole selves, so to speak, to the table. So this little picture of this individual here as being attentive, leaning forward, actively engaged in conversations, committing themselves. So we know we see it when we see it, so to speak. You see when people are connected and engaged with our work, with what's going on in a board meeting, and then some folks who are just simply not as engaged, and they're contributing or not. So then the next question is, do we want all of our board members to be engaged, right? Because one of the areas becomes a concern is my board member is too engaged, too much engaged, and too much directed toward. So part of what we have to think about next is engagement to do what, right? So if engagement is the psychological antecedent to performance, then we want to sort of think a little bit about what areas of performance are important to us and how can we connect up engagement to the performance outcomes that are important to us. So the article that I'm referencing here used discussion decision making as the performance measure, so that the more that people were engaged in conversation, discussion, managing and processing information, the dynamics of conversation, and actually contributing in ways that is useful, and then furthermore, thinking about how you can make judgments and decision making. This is related to our desire to have governing boards, right? So our desire to have governing boards means that we have to facilitate their capacity to engage in discussion and effective decision making so that they can facilitate the strategy of our organization and where we want to try and go and the way we begin to conceptualize or position ourselves. And so we could drop other things into the model. Here's the whole model as it lays itself out. We could lock other things into this performance measure over here, but the way that the article was written was toward these kinds of constructs. So it's not written necessarily specifically engagement toward fundraising or engagement toward relationship management. You could drop other kinds of components in here in reference to some performance measures. In fact, the constructs over here are fairly general. It has to do with the way that we think about what are the pieces of advice that we might give to facilitate toward this dimension over here in reference to performance. If we're talking about fundraising, are we clear about how people understand their responsibilities, their sense of capacity? I'll talk about each one of these. So if I've talked about these two components briefly, I want to talk a little bit more about these four components on this side, the antecedents of engagement. And I know Kenny's watching the chat box, so feel free to slip in questions or interrupt me if you need to. I just want to get through some of this a little bit and then get into some of these components. But feel free to pose a question if I'm going too fast or if I'm saying something that's not clear. So just to be able to remind you on that piece. And Kenny, you jump in and interrupt me, or Nicole do the same. Okay, so if we want to talk about the antecedents, the components that contribute to the capacity of individuals to be fully present and engaged in a board meetings and board participation, component one is what we call task ownership. It really is pretty simply around this clarity around knowing what it is we want to get done and what is my responsibility? Am I responsible for it? So clarifying. So I always like this stat. Right. So according to Board Source with their survey, just over half of the respondents felt that their board members were not well informed about what their responsibilities were, what it is that they were supposed to do. Right. So that's this slide here. So we do have some good reason to believe that people don't even fully understand what they're supposed to do as a board member. What is it that I'm supposed to do? So if people don't have a clear sense of what their task is, what they're responsible for, they're not going to do it. They're going to do something else, or they're going to make it up and they're going to do something on their own. Right. And so we want to try and be able to avoid that and obviously be able to clarify for folks. So we pulled together a couple of ideas, a couple of thoughts about really, but it has to do fundamentally with clarifying what the goals, what are our priorities for this board, and then helping individuals think about themselves in relation to that. So one is clarifying what are the goals and priorities for your board and board members. Clear expectations. So I know many of you probably have contracts and things like that that you might ask people to, agreements that you might ask people to be able to do. Also talk about the importance of simply educating people. So a fair amount of what we do at our session on leadership and board service is just clarifying board roles and responsibilities and helping people begin to think a little bit about how they might contribute as an individual, what's their individual level of engagement in some of those roles and responsibilities. We also talk a little bit about sort of just highlighting what it is that the organization is trying to do, and then clarifying how board members add value. So thinking back to that original diagram that I just had put up originally, this idea that board members contribute to performance. So if we're talking about the importance of reputation, let's say, so then we help board members begin to think about, well, part of why we need you here is because we need you to manage these particular relationships. We need you to be able to advocate for us in these different kinds of contexts, because it's that degree of legitimacy about who we are is partly contingent on your capacity as a board member to give that to our organization or contribute that to our organization. It's why we need you to engage in those kinds of responsibilities. So clarifying how particular board functions or roles adds value to the importance of your organization can help people clarify, oh, that's my job. That's the thing I'm supposed to do. And that's the key component here. We want people to begin to say, oh, that's the stuff that board members do and how they do it. And part of the challenge we run into here, right, is people come up to your table, so to speak, come up to the boardroom with differing ideas about what boards are supposed to do. And so really having a conversation about some clear sense about what are the things that our board is prioritized to do, get people coming from different kinds of organizations, different kinds of places, different kinds of experiences. And I think for a lot of folks, it's not necessarily clear what I want my board to be able to do and how I want them to be able to contribute and give back. And so this conversation is pretty important. And again, it's a fundamental idea. We all know this about the importance of setting goals and being clear about what it is that we need to get done as a basic component of facilitating somebody's capacity to get something done, right? The second one is related to the first one, but it's kind of the personal one. So it's one thing, we want the board members to raise money, but what's the first reaction that people do is they're like, I don't know how to do that. I'm not any good at that. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to do that, right? So they don't have much in the sense of a perceived ability around some of this. And so this sort of lack of confidence, if you will, this sort of sense of, well, you want me to do something, but I don't know how to do it, so I'm not going to do it. So I know what you want, but I'm not going to do it because I don't think I can do it very well, or I'm not going to engage in that process. So somehow we have to be able to facilitate a way to be able to say, you can do it. You are capable. And part of that had to do with what we were looking at that diagram, right? Is, are we picking people? Are we thinking about the folks we're bringing into the boardroom and trying to think about the competencies that they bring in? What are their capabilities? Or are they all the same? Right. So you need something, you need folks to facilitate and manage relationships with parts of Texas A&M University, let's say. How many people do you need from the university to facilitate that kind of role and responsibility? Or do you need other kinds of things, right? So there can be redundancies so that's why we talk about this idea of gaps, right? So can we identify how board members contribute to particular components of our needs as a group, as a composite? So both thinking about the individual and what they bring, and then thinking about the dimensions on how they fit across. People can then conceptualize their individual role in relation to those broader group roles around the board. So thinking about how people are brought in, clarifying that, we hear that again and again and again as an important component, right? Clarifying how people come into the board and what the expectations are on the front end of a lot of this stuff. Making sure board members have the tools that they need. So that can be as simple as just educating people about the development process. Here's how development works, right? So this is why we cultivate. This is how we identify. These are some of the tasks that are, you know, a number of folks may not be familiar with the basic process of development, and thinking about how we go through that process and clarifying, here's what we do. Here's the things that we have to be able to facilitate that. Here's the materials that we have, et cetera, et cetera. Clarifying the value that individuals bring during the process. We're bringing you in because we think you can contribute in this way. We've seen that you've done that before, or that you've expressed interest in being able to do that. The role of committees can be key. We're going to talk about structural components as well. Committees are a key factor as well in being able to clarify how people can contribute. Oh, once I'm in a committee, I clear what the committee needs to be done, and I can think about what my role and responsibility is within that. There's a couple of ideas. Next one, the next two shift just a little bit from clarity around tasks and roles and my perceptions about my ability. And the next two, this one comes up in reference to values and basically attachments. Am I committed? So alignment of personal priorities and organizational objectives. And it really comes down to this idea of mission attachment, the commitment to the mission and the purpose of our organization. You all know this and the importance of this. It's really quite influential in motivating people to engage. They will put up with a fair amount of stuff if they think that their purpose for being there is related to the mission, especially when their commitment to those values are similar to the values of the organization. So this just clarifies the importance of making sure people understand what it is that you're doing. I think most of you do probably pretty well in that area. But clearly people are inspired to join because of the way that people talk about what's being done there. And so utilizing that to the full extent and clarifying for people the importance of sort of, here's how you fit into the purpose of our organization. So understanding this idea of mission and how it connects to the board and what it does. So there's a variety of things I hear people do, right? Asking folks, have you thought about how your work is related to the mission? Have you reminded, I know the United Way puts the mission up on the wall just to remind people. A variety of things people do. It feels like it can get a little old, I think, sometimes, but it really is quite powerful. And especially in turbulent times like now, when we've got some ambiguity, what we're hearing is those groups that are coming back and saying, wow, it was sort of our message last summer, right? What you were doing 18 months ago, if it was important and valuable then, it's still important and valuable now, and clarifying how some of those things are in place and the attachments that people have to those purposes. So this is a pretty important idea as well. And then the last one has to do with sort of the group elements. It's the way that people feel like, and again, I'm seeing more and more stuff on this as well, as far as engagement and participation. People are not going to participate if they do not feel that it's a safe place and that they can trust others to be able to speak up, to be able to say things that are sort of potentially counter to the flow of the conversation. And that's exactly what you want. I mean, we aren't looking for the thorn in the side of everybody, but we are also looking for people to feel comfortable to be able to speak their mind and to be able to talk about the things that they're considering, right? Because far too often what we're seeing is boards are not speaking up. Boards are not engaged in the way that they need to be, partly because they don't feel like this is a place that is looking for me to be able to kind of speak out or to express concerns in a way. Committees can be a great place to be able to do this as well. A smaller group of 4 or 5 can be a way for people to feel like that they can express their opinion. I'm going to show a slide here in a minute about this idea of sort of collective, what we call collective ignorance, right? Or for those of you who may be familiar with the story of the road to Abilene, right? Which is this idea that One person says, let's go get lunch in Abilene, and everybody wants to just agree and go along with it. And so everybody hops in the car, and then 2 hours later, they're like, what in the world are we doing in the car? And why are we driving off to Abilene to get the best pie that there is, right? And nobody said anything because nobody felt like that they wanted to be able to sort of go against the flow. So this collective ignorance is an example of what can happen when we don't create a safe place. One person can drive the conversation and nobody's willing to jump up and really be able to put that back into order. So some things to think about: considering the relationship with the board and staff, considering board members with each other, pairing up individuals, and really beginning to get to know each other and beginning to think about stuff. This one also makes reference to retreats and some time for some social, right? And just opening time. And I know many of you have talked about sort of what do? We feed them before, we feed them after. We try to be able to figure out a way. It's particularly tricky now in these environments where we might not be in the same room, or some people don't want to be in the same room. What could we do? How might we be able to facilitate ways of being able to build trust? And it really oftentimes happens with one or two, right? Ability to be able to lean over and say to somebody, what was going on? What's going on here? Can I ask these questions? Is it a dumb question? Is it not a dumb question? And being able to sort of clarify and gain that level of feeling like this is a safe place for us to have open and honest conversations, and to really be able to have those kinds of conversations that maybe are challenging in some ways, but really provide some good information for us to be able to make some decisions. Two more ideas I need to introduce in this model, and they're not insignificant. So we've looked at this idea of these four components contribute to this idea of an engaged board member. So if we work on these, we're likely to increase the capacity of board members to be engaged. And if we clarify what it is that we're trying to get done, we get this linkage between here. But there's a couple of things that can really get in the way and can thwart our ability to be able to be successful or effective. And that's what these two are really touching on, is this idea of situational constraints. And this really has to do a lot with meeting management, the way that we manage our information, the way that we manage the group, the way that we provide information, the way that we frame conversations and discussions. And again, the role of leaders here is critical, especially the board chair. We hear again and again and again, the board chair can be effective at facilitating conversations and discussion in a boardroom, or they can be, you can stifle and sort of drive a lot of this stuff out. And if you want people to be connected, are we listening to the variety of voices? Good facilitation and good agenda setting here can do quite a bit to be able to create the right context, if you will, so that there is room to be able to engage. And so there's a fair amount of stuff here that we could unpack about how this is done. And this gets pretty practical in some sense. And so keeping in place a few different things, and one of the key elements that people may be familiar with, is that idea of a consent agenda. Let's try and remove some of the reporting and really be able to make room for some discussion and conversation about key issues and concerns that are important to us. The next one I want to talk about is the group dynamics. And this is the cartoon that I was thinking about, right, where they all agree, but they don't all agree, right? And they're not willing to speak up. So the nature of the culture of your group, and again, this too is a pretty important idea, in the way that we sense that people work together, the norms of the group, the way that there is a cohesion or sort of subgroups. I'm sure many of you have seen this, where the factions start to pull apart. This group pulls to this side, this group pulls to that side. There's a variety of sort of senses of a lack of cohesion amongst group members. So those can be examples. Got a couple of other slides here that I put in just to kind of remind ourselves about why culture is important. I couldn't resist dropping in the Drucker slide, right, where he gives this sort of quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast, so we can be as thoughtful, as clear as what we want to do. But if you've got a bad culture in your organization, and you got a bad culture at the boardroom, people are not going to be connected and engaged. A few other thoughts here about this idea. But this one touches on it right here, right? Awareness of shared cultural builds trust, cohesion, and a sense of safety among members, which facilitates collaboration and engagement. So building that sense of culture, building that sense of commitment to the group and to the organization facilitates that decision-making process. And again, that's a whole nother sort of tangent in some ways that we could get into and talk a little bit more about how do we build the culture of our group so that it can be more constructive. Or so once you've done some of those other things, or once you're doing, and that's the other reality with these models, right? And why these models sort of can get a little bit tiring in some ways, is that they all work together. All of these components are working concurrently, and part of what we try to do with these models is to facilitate a recognition that in order for us to manage some of these things, we've got to break them down into components so that we can begin to facilitate how we manage them, modify them, adjust them, tick them off sort of one at a time. Okay, we're getting clearer about orienting people and bringing them in so that they've got a clearer sense about what their role is and how they're supposed to be able to do it. And we're doing pretty good about getting people put into committees. And then we realize, oh my gosh, we're not really facilitating committees very well. Committees aren't being facilitated and managed in a way. They're not getting the kind of information that they need to be able to make the kinds of decisions. Committees are waiting or not, right? And so then what's going to happen? People are going to become disconnected. They're going to become unsupportive of what's going on. So I think this is a little bit, one more of the little slides around culture, about creating the agreements that we have to work together. But this is the summary of the slides, right? So of the model, right? So we've got our 4 antecedents: task ownership, perceived abilities, values congruence, and trust and safety, which facilitates engagement. And we've got our 2 moderators around group dynamics and situational constraints. So we built this model. Happy to talk about it some more. But part of the other reason I'm sharing this with you today is we have an opportunity to be able to. We're piloting and testing and exploring some assessments and some diagnostics around some of this. And so that's the other piece of what I want to talk about today is, we have some tools that have been developed, and we'd kind of like to try them out, and we're starting to. So some invitations have gone out already. You may have received them, and I know a few folks have already said, "Hey, we're up for it, and we want to participate and assess our board basically on that model and look at the way that our board is performing or engaging." And so there's a little bit here about the process, but maybe I'll take a moment. I'll talk about the process, but also, and then open up. Is there anything going on there in the discussion thread that I should do that before not a ton? Okay. I'll go on ahead and talk about the survey then, it seems like. So the survey is 2 surveys, one for the executive director and one for board members. Talks about sort of the components of the model, as I discussed. We also touch on the idea of board performance. We actually ask questions about individuals. We ask you to rank individual board members and think about how well they're doing. So that plays into it as well. And then some basic background information about you as an executive and the background of the organization. And then there's a second survey for board members themselves. And we ask them some similar questions, and we ask them about the components as well. Do you feel like you're connected? Do you have a clear sense of what your responsibilities are? Do you have a clear sense that these are, ownership? Do you feel like that this is a safe place? What's the nature of the culture of the group and the decision-making processes that are happening here? And then tell us a little bit about who you are as an individual. And what we'll do with that, obviously I want the data. I want to be able to try and explore, and I want to test this model. I want to see it. As Nicole knows, I've got a presentation coming up here at an academic research group. So I need data, but that's beside the point. But what's in it for you is that it'll give you a diagnostic at the board level. And so what we'll do is we'll provide a report, individualized report back to you all in reference to, here's what we saw in the responses. The more data we get, the more we're going to be able to do comparables. And so talk about your group in relation to others. We don't have a ton of that right now. But we'll continue to be able to gather that up. And I've done this before with some other kinds of assessments. We can then facilitate a session just to kind of review the information with your board, talk about some of this stuff, review the material. If you want us to, we can go into as much detail or as little as you wanted to talk about here's what these components are, but it would be a relatively straightforward diagnostic of here's what we're seeing. People have got a lot of unclarity around. So as you think about that model again, we might say, oh, you're pretty good, 1, 2, 3, and 4 on some of these antecedents, and overall people are modestly engaged, but they're feeling like the decision-making culture or the structures of the situations of the board are not quite as conducive to engagement as necessary, or some of the other areas around our capacity to be able to do that. So I think I will pause for a minute and open up for questions, concerns, both about the models, thoughts about your own board in reference to how it engages or doesn't engage, challenges you've run into, concerns or things you've thought about in reference to, yeah, I've got board members engaged, but they're doing the wrong stuff. That's a fairly sometimes when I'm giving this talk, I say it's called board engagement. We all want it, don't we? Right. So this idea that somehow board members can be directed in the wrong orientation. So that's open in this conversation as well. Yeah. So I'm going to pause. We've got plenty of time. And I'm going to come back. I'm going to go back to this slide here as one factor, one component in reference to, and I'll see what's.
Hey, well.
Hey, Royce.
Hey.
Thought about you as I was prepping these slides up. Good to see you there. I almost grabbed some of our stuff from the other day.
Well, I'll tell you what, a good job. I was interested in, you were talking about the under trust and safety, staff board mentorship. And I wondered if you elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think in that instance, I'm thinking a little bit about how committees typically is where we might see something like this, where we might have a liaison to a particular committee. So as we task this committee or that committee, we then start to see, well, okay, as the executive, I'm having trouble managing all of these 20, some boards are quite, your board was quite large, right? 25 even or so members, right? So it can be tricky to manage. I mean, you were an expert, right? So you could manage a lot of those relationships, but having some backup, right? Having a second person in command who's running a committee or facilitating a committee can be quite useful. They can gather information that you might not have time to be able to manage or facilitate. Yeah, that's kind of what we're thinking about. I think you got to be careful. Sometimes it can thwart people as they wonder who their key point of contact is. But the idea is that's one way. What were you thinking?
No, as a matter of fact, I like that. One of the things I always did was whoever was assigned to work with the committee from the staff, one of their jobs was when they saw the board getting off, or the committee getting off track, I would be at the next meeting.
There you go.
That was my way of knowing I've got to shift some time to that. So that worked good. I didn't know if there was, you were talking where a specific staff member was working with a board member.
It depends on size and some of the
versus the committee structure.
I think most of the time it plays itself out in the committee structure.
Yeah.
That seems to be the healthiest, and it can be the most instrumental, and it can facilitate those committees, as a great example, because they can go off the rails or they can get lost.
Yeah.
And they may not even move. And I know that one of the pushbacks from staff members is, it's just a whole nother thing I got to do. Now, all of a sudden I got to manage this group. I got to set the agenda. And so working with them, it can be developmental for staff members. You've seen this as well. Well, how are you going to manage with these people, right? They actually want to help. They're here they're not showing up not only for the, to have the cocktail or whatever it is, or to have lunch. If we're giving them lunch as a group, they're showing up because they believe in what we're doing. And supposedly you do too. So it's kind of a pain, but if you could actually get them to work in the right direction, and I like your guidance there around pointing people in the right direction, it can be instrumental, but it's not insignificant in time. And that's the pushback that I hear a lot of times is, staff, or the other problem is a staff member is given too many committees.
Yeah.
So you got six committees that you got to staff, and you're doing nothing else other than setting up meetings for the next committee. How's that feel, Nicole? Does that resonate with you at all in reference to?
Resonates a little bit. And it, not directly because I love my board, but ties into a question.
Everybody loves their board. Everybody loves their board. She's just
Amen.
saying that because I'm on her board. No, what were you going to say?
That actually ties into a question that someone put, CJ Marchain. Apologies if I didn't pronounce your name right. They asked, what do you do with an overzealous board that might have too many committees with too many members that end up with nothing to do?
Right. Yeah. So we were touching on that just a little bit. CJ, did you want to client? You can go ahead and speak up if you've got a follow up, or if we want to touch on something more specific in that. Oh.
I'll need to call in.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, it can be a problem, and I think that has to do with one of the slides on the front end around task ownership, or what are our priorities. And I am a big fan of task forces. I know that those can be problematic in some ways. A few standing committees, we got to monitor the finances. Maybe we've got maybe we've got one other committee that's standing. Maybe we've got a governance committee or something, and then maybe a couple of task forces that we've set up for the year. That's one way. Some people, but the pushback on that is, God, I got to keep reestablishing these things or getting them going. Yeah, do we really need, I was at a group, I won't call anybody out, and they must have had, 8 unfunctioning committees. So they really had none that were really, they had one, maybe the executive committee or something was the one that was barely functioning and engaging. Yeah, I think you got to set some priorities, and you got to set some thoughts in reference to, I think it's interesting. I'd also have conversations about overall, what is it that we're expecting our board to do? So some of this happens from life stage stuff too, right? So you get this shift from a group that was primarily what we might call a working board, or a board that was engaged in every aspect. What's Nicole's got in some ways, right? She is the only part-time staff person for her group, and she's got to rely on board members to fulfill functions. Royce, you had to do this too. You had a small number of individuals. We all rely on these boards in different capacities, and at times they get engaged in what might be just staff work or volunteer work or something. They almost shift from being a board member to a volunteer. And sometimes if you can clarify that for people, well, this is called a board committee, but in reality, it's really just a volunteer committee for us to be able to put on this event. This isn't necessarily a governance task. It's a thing that we need some help with to get done because it's a project of our organization, and clarifying for people the difference between what is a governance task versus what is sort of work of the organization that needs to get done. And many of you function in this middle ground where you've got historically working boards who've done a lot of stuff, no staff, 1 staff, 2 staff, and you rely on them a lot. But then things start to shift. They start to say, we need a professional, we need to do this. And you never have that conversation about who's supposed to be doing what, and when am I engaging with somebody as a board member versus when am I engaging as a volunteer. And so that can be a distinction sometimes that may play into that as well. I see the question here about what makes an effective or efficient committees. Yeah, I guess Duchess, I might need just a little bit more about what you're thinking about, but partly had to do with for me, so clarifying what it is that we need from the committee, right? So what are the priorities this year? If it's a standing committee, I would look to the committee to say, what are your priorities this year? What are your expectations this year? What are the objectives for what you want to try and get done this year? And then think a little bit about composition. How is it that we think about who's on this committee? So you clarify what the charge is, so to speak. And I would revisit that on an annual basis and say, what is it that this committee is doing, and how is it necessary this year? Is it being functional and instrumental? Sometimes, and I think Royce's observation that they can go left, they can take a left turn without even knowing it. And then some kind of support. The other piece I've seen is they need some kind of guidance. and even the best of committees functioning entirely as volunteers, I'm curious in people's reaction on that. Maybe they've got some that are working. They've got a few dedicated folks that are willing to, and that's the other piece. I mean, you get a leadership in there who is a volunteer who actually knows how to work with groups. And so you've got somebody who can manage and actually has the time, right? So there are a number of individuals that have some time who might be willing to do, but some kind of support. Committees just to rely on the group to guide themselves and to get things done doesn't seem like it's always the most instrumental. You got to get in there and get some support. And I either look for staff or I look for the kind of volunteer which then means maybe we can't have 12, maybe we can't have 6. Maybe we really just should be thinking about 3. Or one that's set up for a particular purpose. And then, I've been advocating for this for the group that Nicole manages. Let's do less instead of just running all over the place, right? But the challenge is in an environment like this, and the pushback is well, but we got to foster innovation. We got to let new things happen. We got to go to some other kinds of ways with some of this stuff. I see another question come in, but I think I'm going to let Nicole or Kenny figure that one. Read that one. It's a little long.
Yeah, in the interim, Will, there was one about recruiting and this environment. I'm assuming in a pandemic, just any tips related to recruitment of members. And
yeah, it's challenging. One is what is it that we're looking for? So the longer you can have those conversations. So the typical process that I see in a lot of recruitment board stuff is, 6 weeks before we need a new board member, we ask everybody sitting at the table, who do you know that can serve on the board? Can you ask them to come and tell them it's not going to be a lot of work? So clarifying that the responsibilities, but then also clarifying what it is that you need. Did you notice we had that slide there about, so that doesn't solve your problem. That just facilitates a little bit to clarify what we're looking for and what we need. But it potentially facilitates your ability to be able to focus a little bit. Well, we really need somebody a little bit younger, and we'd love to have somebody maybe in the banking industry. Okay, let's use those 2 pieces of information and then use that as a way to try and reach out a little bit more strategically than just simply asking the 1 or 2 people that are in the room. And then longer term, don't do it 2 weeks before you need somebody. Try to do it 6 months before and try and keep an ongoing list. When I hear individuals who are more effective in recruitment, they tend to think about this actually for quite some time, and it's an ongoing process. And then in encouraging as many other board members to participate in that as well. And so there's a couple of thoughts about recruitment that I might prioritize about some of that.
Yeah, maybe we should ask Emily to chime in personally, but the essence of the question sounds like as an individual or sole staff member of an organization, not having the bandwidth to take on responsibility for everything. So how do you pass some of that responsibility on to board members?
What do you think, Kenny?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, sometimes, it sounds like the crickets that she mentioned, that there's just not the expertise there of folks that would want to take on, say, being on a COVID task force or staying abreast of public, health directives out there and whatever community that they serve in. And so usually what I would try to do is find folks in the field that were interested in something like that and try to pair them up with a board member so that they could increase their expertise. I mean, you can still have one of the things that always worked for me. I'd be interested to hear what other folks think, but one of the things that always worked for me is just to keep in mind that you don't need board members to advocate for your organization. They don't have to have a formal board member role. And so if there's some expertise missing, sometimes that mentoring component can be relationship that you have in your community that you could pair up with a board member to get their expertise skill set up on a particular topic to help them along the way, and they're still an advocate or just a deep relationship that you have as an executive. One way or the other, I think, Will, you kind of mentioned in some of it as well, is that if you are the sole executive, there's still a responsibility almost regardless of bandwidth. So somehow you have to find a way to balance that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, the other piece is sometimes to come to terms with what we're capable of being able to do. I mean, sometimes we see so much need or so much demand or so much potential in reference to our organizations. But a key piece of being an executive like that, I mean, if you talk about the fabric of our society in some ways and the commitment that you all make. And so, I mean, the continued resilience or continued capacity to be able to fulfill that function is almost more important in some ways than your capacity to get something done in the next 6 months. And so, I mean, I really like Kenny's piece of thoughts around, okay, so your board maybe doesn't have the current capabilities or capacity, and maybe you can't really recruit this particular individual to serve as a board member. Their commitment level is different, their time commitments are, maybe they could help a little bit for a short period of time around a particular thing. I think that's a pretty interesting observation. Come to 2 meetings for us and help us guide just a little bit so we can make some decisions that need to get made.
Well, there's one other thing that I find really useful, and I've just helped an organization in another part of the state work on their board with the ownership issue.
Okay.
And I noticed in the question, it was like, we'll ask for questions. They'll say, oh, sure, we'll help you with whatever. But we can't get around that individual time. So what I did with the executive director, she had 3 different things that she really needed help with the board. She's a single staff member as well. And so we went through and said, who's the right person? One of them happened to be a former board member, to bring them back on and to kind of re-engage them. But we sorted through, and I've asked her to quit asking for help in a group. Because you rely on, then we have social loafing, right? And everybody thinks somebody will help. We all feel good because we say we'll help and we get up and leave. So I said, don't do that. Don't introduce the ideas first to the group. Instead, go to the individual and tell them exactly why you think they're the right person to lead it and get their commitment to do it before you go and ask the board in a broader sense. And she's really seen success with that in the last about 4 months.
That's great. That's good advice.
A little tactical.
Yeah, tactical. I mean, right. I mean, that's what people are asking. Well, give me some tips that sort of make sense. Thanks, Angela. I appreciate that.
Also looks like Jennifer and Lisa were asking the same thing, the best way to help a board member see that it's time to roll off the board. I'll start, but feel free. Yeah, my experience has been is just to, kind of like what Angela said, have a direct conversation with them. And you as the executive, if you're responsible for the mission of your organization, it's just to have that conversation with them. My experience has been that every time I needed a board member to roll off and I had a personal conversation with them, to specifically address that, usually something had changed in their life while they weren't able to participate maybe in a way that they once were able to. And usually there was a, good outcome with that they understood that they were taking up a legal spot on your board. If they weren't able to make board meetings or whatever the real issue is as to why they aren't involved, usually just a direct conversation would highlight something that had changed in their life why they couldn't participate maybe the way that they once could. And usually they would be willing to step down and still take on that ambassador role, still be a stakeholder to the organization, but then understood the realities of taking up space when you could use someone that was ready to put energy into your mission as a legal fiscal agent of your organization.
That's, yeah. And anybody else got any thoughts on that one? Want to chime in about helping a board member roll off when it's time?
Well, I think I'm a big believer in having your bylaws have a forced rotation where there's term limits, and that saves time. I also agree with what Kenny said, because sometimes when you approach someone, they were actually looking for a graceful way out and they couldn't find it because, as he mentioned, things have changed in their life and they don't want to feel like they're letting you down. So that at least I know there's a fair amount of time I've had that situation as well, and they just don't want to come to you and say, I can't do this anymore for you.
Right. Or the alternative is you just let the time run out, right? You go 3-year term, it's going to rotate off, and we'll just let it be and let the
every nonprofit I've been involved with that didn't have term limits, before I left, the bylaws had been amended, because I just you can't let people just become lifelong board members of your organization. It's not healthy for them or you.
Too easy. Yeah, it's too easy. I think Kenny's observation, there's ways you can keep people connected outside of actually being a board member that might actually be more functional for them.
Exactly.
Angela, what were you thinking?
That's what I was thinking. The example I just shared with everyone, one of the things we did with the organization was have to introduce term limits. So we explained, had the executive director explain why that was so important for the organization. But also because she had a few of those lifers that she didn't want to, lose their support. She didn't want to hurt them either because they've been involved for so long. We're looking at, we started looking at things like emeritus board status as a way to still let them feel good about things. They'll still get newsletters a few times a year, but they're not going to be voting active members anymore. But it's just a way to sort of celebrate them on the way out. And that can be really powerful, especially when it's a situation where you've never had limits before. So either a lifetime or emeritus status, that way you can celebrate them.
Right, because that's the counter, right, is you've got people who are committed and you don't want to have to sort of lose them or what have you. And there sometimes it creates a culture, but by and large, some of my early work was helping people figure out how to do just that, Angela, put in place those kinds of rules because they needed some new perspective, they needed some new voices, but they needed to also respect the people that were there. And I think it can be done. I've seen it actually done in lots of instances when it can work. And people, and then you actually expand your range of stakeholders that are committed to you. I have had my experience as being part of that group, and I still think positively about those experiences, but I'm not serving for the rest of my life as a board member.
And you can still call on them to make sure they lead your annual giving efforts because they're valuable members of the organization. You just don't have to worry about them voting.
Yeah, I like Pam's observation that they can facilitate that role of the committee, right? Facilitating the committees to be able to support that guidance that can happen, that needs to happen on the committee. They have oftentimes quite a bit of knowledge and expertise that they can bring to help guide what needs to get done on that committee level. So they can be helpful there too.
Yeah, Jennifer posed that question, and just real quick, it says she doesn't have terms in her bylaws, and I didn't know if you wanted to chime in if that was intentional or if you had received pushback on term limits, or was it something that you just hadn't got to at this point? Jennifer, if you're still there.
I am, and thank you for the conversation. I run the nonprofit for the San Antonio Spurs, so it's a little bit differently where we do have people that are owners of the Spurs that are on my board, and we definitely have a legacy board for a few where Pop sits on and things like that. That's that legacy board that we spoke about. But having a board where some people in the community that are on it feel like I get to say I'm on this board, but that's probably all they do all year. And so trying to figure out how to have those conversations, tried to have it with a couple and even the president trying to have that conversation and some pushback about wanting to leave. So that's where I posed that question. And yes, we don't have it in the bylaws now, but something that I'm going to go back to and discuss on, can we amend the bylaws and put a 2-year limit in there? Because I have people that have been on just for, over a decade, 15 years.
Yeah. Right. And it's prestigious, right, to be a part of that and so thinking about sort of, are there places, you say you got the legacy board, Yeah, I mean, also, when I've seen it work is when you're able to have those conversations. I've seen it work in a couple of different ways. One, with Royce's observation, some people just slowly rotate off. That doesn't seem to be your context. So simply having the conversation about the importance of bringing new perspectives in sometimes can facilitate stuff. It's surprising how boards, when you can, and elevating the mission, remember what we're here for, remember what we're trying to do, and what our purposes are, and clarifying what sometimes that can help. And boards can begin to see the need or the appropriateness of trying to make room for others, especially if they feel like there's still a place for them in some capacity, that they can be, right? Because part of it is their social status comes from some of that, which is not uncommon, both the relationships and the title. And so you have to be a little careful. But I applaud you for bringing in the volunteer, right? You don't want to be the only one as the executive trying to push people out of the room. Bringing in a volunteer to have that conversation as well is really important. And some of the other stakeholders that you have that see that same objective.
Well, that's where your board chairman comes in too, unless he's the one you want to rotate off. But I really believe strongly about getting the volunteers to have those kind of conversations. One thing I did one time was I grandfathered some folks in to get the bylaws changed. I mean, it's more of a long-term solution than a short-term solution, but we grandfathered some in, not permanently, but like if let's say, I think we put in, you could have 2 3-year terms and then you had to rotate off a year and then you could come back. But we didn't count all their previous time. And right. So they started seeing they had some years still left, but I felt like it was more important to get the bylaws changed where the problem in that organization doesn't have that problem now. And interestingly enough, once we got it in, they all bought into it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've seen, Royce, and I've forgotten about that example of, I mean, making exceptions for a few people sitting around the table, but eventually kind of beginning to roll those in. And in most instances, I've seen that exact, especially in the work that I've seen with associations and some of the larger groups that I've worked with where they've had to put these things in place. Usually boards see the reason why it needs to get done. And as long as they feel like that there's some protection and respect for them as an individual, they're more than willing to try and be able to do that. I want to be sensitive to folks' time, try and wrap up. I appreciate the conversation, everybody.